Good afternoon, everyone. I want to talk to you today about the Bible's role in the coming of the American Revolution. What I'll suggest to you is that the Bible, the Old Testament in particular is what I'm talking about, shaped the political sensibilities of Americans in a way that explains the fears that drove them to resist Britain's imperial policy and eventually to rebel. To do that, however, I need to briefly explain what the American Revolution was. What drove Americans from their homes and into the streets and onto the battlefield. Now, most of us are taught and believe that the American Revolution was either a tax revolt or a war of national liberation, by which we mean that a bunch of British colonists came to see themselves over time as Americans and came to see the British government as a foreign government, at which point they rebelled for national liberation, against this, this foreign government. This second explanation is debatable. There's evidence for and against, but reasonable people can disagree. I'm against it. I think the evidence that that Americans identified as a nation and viewed the British government as foreign is weak. I think the evidence for that is weak. But like I said, reasonable people can disagree on that. The first explanation, the idea that this was a tax revolt, this explanation has no merit, no evidence. It has counter evidence and should therefore be dismissed out of hand. To me, the strongest, clearest, and simplest evidence is that the American Revolution was an attempt to preserve the status quo against the British government's efforts to change the empire's governing system, what historians call the imperial constitution, and how the empire was constituted. So the British Empire historically had a very weak central government and very strong local governments. It's a system that historians refer to as salutary neglect or benign neglect. It's basically, it's the equivalent of what we today would call states' rights. Okay, so it's a system, governing system of strong local governments under a weak central government. Okay, so today we call it states' rights. When we refer to the colonial period, the same principle, the same structure is referred to as salutary neglect or benign neglect. Doesn't matter now the origins of that phrase. So, so basically each colony governed itself in virtually all aspects of public life according to local custom and local interests and local circumstances and conditions. But the British government did wield soft power, influence within these colonies. Okay, so it wasn't hard power they couldn't dictate to local governments, since Britain had no manpower on this, virtually no manpower on this side of the ocean to enforce its will. Okay? Instead, the imperial government depended on local authorities' goodwill. Okay? And therefore colonial assemblies had to be asked or cajoled or enticed or bribed to go along with the policies that Britain wanted to see on the ground, okay? Until the French and Indian War, which lasted between 1755 and 1763. Once the war ended in 1763, Britain tried to change this salutary neglect system, this states' rights system, and create a more centralized government for the empire, for the entire empire. They try to transform the empire from a decentralized empire in which local populations govern themselves into a centralized empire governed from the center, from the top. And that's what the imperial reforms of the 1760s and 70s, the 1760s and 70s did. The Sugar Act and the Stamp Act and the Declaratory Act and the Townshend Duties, the Coercive Acts, the Quebec Act, all of them were about this effort, were parts of an effort from London to change the structure of the empire, the way the empire was constituted, into a more centralized imperial administration. And that's why all these acts that I just listed for you, that's why they immediately triggered suspicion and fear and resistance on the part of the colonists who tried to protect the status quo, to preserve and restore the old system of imperial governance against these innovations. And because neither side gave way, it produced a war, it produced a breaking point, and shots were fired. And it was this amazing conflict in which a bunch of civilians took on the world's greatest military and naval and commercial and economic superpower. So that's the story. Okay. What still requires explanation is why. Okay. What made self-government so viscerally important to these English colonists in America that they risked so much for it, and in the face of such great odds? You know, why is it that these British communities in America feared and opposed centralized government or arbitrary power, arbitrary government on principle, to a degree that most of us won't oppose even when it's actually practiced on us? Okay, so that's what I'd like to discuss today. Okay, it's a question that I think the Bible can help us understand, help us answer. Now, of course, we will never be able to explain exactly why and when and where even Anglo-Americans developed such fear about arbitrary power. But wherever these fears came from, I want to stress that they were not American. They were not uniquely American. Okay? We saw the same fears producing major rebellions in Old England in the 1640s, 1680s, and this is the English Civil War in the 1640s and the Glorious Revolution in 1688. And to these two English rebellions, you can add also two rebellions in Scotland and in England in 1715 and 1745 over similar fears. Okay. What's common to all these British rebellions, okay, the two in England, the two in Scotland, the two in Scotland were not solely in Scotland, they were British affairs in general. My point. So what was common to these four British rebellions and to the last one in America, the fifth one, was an attachment, an almost obsession with self-government and a driving fear of arbitrary power. They feared a strong central government that did not consult or consider the wishes of the people, because they did not believe in benevolent rulers. Okay? They believed that people with power will abuse it. Okay? People with power will abuse it. Any person, no matter how good and decent. Okay? Give that person power, and the result will be abuse of power. Okay? So their insistence on government by consent, that is self-government, representative government, government in which the people give their consent to the laws that govern them. This insistence on government by consent, representative government, etc., was simply the practical solution to the fear, this obsession with arbitrary power. Representative government is simply the way to prevent an individual from gaining too much power. So even though many historians discuss this fear of centralized power as uniquely American, it should actually be understood as commonly English or British. Okay? It's as English as steak and kidney pie. Okay? Because the belief or the conviction that people with power will abuse it was commonly English, not uniquely American. Okay? And everything that is associated with Anglo-American political culture flows from this understanding of human nature. Okay? Our political institutions, the procedures in our legislatures, the procedures in our criminal courts, the attachment to local government, the fear of concentrating power in one man or in one group of people, or in one institution, the checks, the balances, all these principles on display, all the principles that are on display in the English Bill of Rights, in American state constitutions, in the Articles of Confederation, in the Federal Constitution, the American Bill of Rights, all these laws, all these procedures, all the constitutions, all the constitutional principles of separation of powers, etc., they all address this core conviction that people with power will abuse it. And so these principles and regulations and procedures aim to keep power diffuse rather than concentrated. Instead of allowing power to concentrate in the central government, in the local government, in the courtroom, in the church, those people aimed to negate this tendency of power to concentrate, to actively try to keep it diffuse. So we're faced again. So we see this in all of our, again, core procedures, political procedures, et cetera, and in structures and constitutions. We see this trait in Americans or in Anglo-Americans or in English people in America and elsewhere, which leads us back to the question of what made the English so viscerally afraid of arbitrary power, so afraid of abuse of power that they rebelled against centralizing governments 5 times over the course of a century, of 130 years. 5 rebellions, some major, some not so major, but well, 4 major ones. 1715 wasn't as earth-shattering. Now, there really is evidence that this was an English trait. I mean, contemporary evidence from back in the day, because when the non-English, so the non-English settlers in North America, Germans, French, Dutch, there were, when we look at the American Revolution, there were 4 major groups of non-Anglo settlers here. Okay, there were the French in Canada, there were Germans, there were Dutch, and there were Africans. Okay, now the Africans were, the vast majority of them were enslaved, and so so we need to look at their response to the American Revolution differently, because you can understand that they were not gung-ho to support their enslavers. Although many African Americans did participate in the American Revolution, and we highlight or our histories highlight the contributions of, from the beginning with the Boston Massacre and Crispus Attucks to the Black regiments who fought in the American Revolution. But I'm digressing. If we put African American slaves to the side, since their motivations were complicated by their status, their legal status of enslavement, if you look at the Germans, French, and Dutch in America, you see that they were not particularly responsive to the revolutionary movement in the colonies. Okay. For example, in Canada, I apologize, the lawnmowers are outside and the dogs are threatening to bark. In any case, in Canada, the Americans hoped that the French would join their rebellion. That as soon as the Americans send 1,000 people to Canada, the vast numbers of French settlers there, 70,000, would flock to them, greet them as liberators, and liberate them from British oppression. But they didn't. The French were pretty cold to the revolutionary propaganda from America, and did not join that expeditionary force that American expeditionary force that invaded Canada. Instead, the Canadians who were most responsive to the American cause were the few Englishmen, the few English communities that were in Canada. Okay, so this kind of rhetoric about limited government and local self-government, etc., it spoke to the English in a way that it did not speak to the French. And you can see similar responses from the Dutch and the German populations in the 13 colonies. So again, why the English? The theory that the English conviction about human depravity was a product of Protestantism doesn't hold water, because there were other Protestants. Okay? Swedes were Protestant, Prussians were Protestant. And we don't see this obsession with them, this fear of centralized power in Sweden or Prussia. So to answer this question, you need to look for uniquely English elements. Excuse me, if we're to explain why the English were uniquely obsessed with arbitrary power, uniquely fearful of arbitrary power. And I'd point to two things for certain and one speculation on my part. The speculation is the big part of this talk. So the first certain thing is that English people in England and America never saw policemen in their lives. Okay? It's difficult for you and me to imagine a society without police, given the host of governmental enforcement agencies that regulate virtually every aspect of civic and economic and private life in our societies. Okay? If all of our regulatory and enforcement agencies disappeared, all of our police forces, okay, that police us, disappeared, then you and I would change psychologically over the course of just a few years, maybe even just a few weeks or months. Okay? And our children born into this kind of society will grow up with completely different political sensibilities. Okay? Without police, the policy options available to rulers and legislatures shrink dramatically. Okay? The ruler cannot expect unpopular laws to be enforced, because the only enforcement agency in the land is crowds of citizens, the people. So local communities where there was such a consensus on what needs to be done and how to do it, govern themselves. And the national government exerted only a light touch in your local life, in your local community. Okay? And the result was that, so again, local communities are, they share the circumstances of life, they share history, they share local interests. Again, local circumstances dictate local interests. And as a result, there's a local consensus on how to do what. Okay, and therefore the people can influence their neighbors. Okay, first of all, there's a great deal of agreement, and to the degree that there's disagreement, the majority can influence the minority in soft ways or in harsh ways to follow policy A or B, and so that's the kind of self-government that people lived in their local communities. And the national government, as I said, had a very light footprint in that local community, okay? Because it didn't have an enforcement agency to get its will enacted locally. And the result was that the overriding principle of Anglo-American society was self-government. And English communities in England and in America saw the absence of coercive law enforcement by an army or a police force as the manifestation of a free society, one in which constituents have a role in enacting the laws and the policies that govern them and enforcing those laws and policies. So that's one uniquely English thing that you can point to as, why were the English this way? With their negative view of human nature and their suspicion of centralized government. They were used to local government because of, again, no police force, no standing army. The second thing is related, and that is that being an island made this local resistance to the king, to the central government, stronger. Okay? Because on an island, the king does not need a strong army to protect local communities from foreign invasion. Okay? Therefore, local communities don't fund and support the royal army or the king's ability to raise an army and keep an army as they did in Europe, where communities are not protected by the sea. Local communities really do look to the strongest power in the land, the king, to protect them. Okay, so the people, local communities, local rulers contribute to the king's army, serve in the king's army, accept that the king has a need for an army. Okay, and if the king, the European king, the continental king, kept a standing army, which they did, then the military and political balance, the balance of power between the king and the nobles, between the central government and the local government, was more skewed towards the king, because the king was more militarily powerful and economically powerful. So because England was an island, English kings had a harder time financially keeping a standing army. And when the aristocracy allowed it or tolerated it, it was a small army and underfunded. Okay, so the muscle that the king had within his kingdom was lesser than that of a European king, okay? Because the constituents, the local governments, understood and accepted that their king needed a strong army, something that English constituents and English local aristocrats did not, because they had the protection of being an island. So those are two real things. But beyond these certainties, these uniquely English features, my sense is, and I cannot prove it, but my sense is that another unique element in forming English political sensibilities came from the fact that the English were an Old Testament culture. Okay? I'm not sure why, but it is true. Okay? Many scholars have commented on it, and it's easily supported for the 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries. Okay? The English identified the story of the Israelites as their stories. They saw themselves as the new Israel, as a nation that was on the rise, a nation on which God was smiling. So that they identified with the Israelites coming from Egypt and taking their place among the peoples of the region, of that region. And so this book, the Old Testament, spoke to them. They saw it as, they read it, they saw it as their book. And this is true of the English more so than other Europeans, definitely more than Catholics, but also more than other Protestants in Europe. Okay, there's this, there are books that you can look up about the Hebraic tradition in the English church, where you see the English kind of studying Jewish commentary on the Bible, and and English theologians studying Hebrew and being versed in Talmudic literature, to understand this book that they really did connect with. If you just look up the Hebraic, like I said, the Hebraic tradition in the English church, you'll find a lot of literature on this. Now, religion is not something that I work on or focus on, work on in my research or focus on in my classes, but I've come to suspect that I've been a willing victim of my own personal blinders, being a foreigner to religious sentiment myself. So with regard to the American Revolution, to the Founding Fathers, etc., we're told in our textbooks and in our classes and in documentaries that you'll watch about the American Revolution and the revolutionary leadership, you'll find that you're told that Americans' convictions about human nature and about human government were the product of Enlightenment political philosophy, okay, from theorists like Hobbes and Locke and Montesquieu and Burke and Hume, etc. And also of the Enlightenment's interest in ancient history, in of that era's of intellectuals' interest in the decline and fall of Greek democracy and Roman republicanism, etc. And they point to the fact that, again, the John Adamses and George Washingtons were versed in Enlightenment philosophy and in Enlightenment theorists and in Roman histories, Roman and Greek histories. And there's no doubt they were. I mean, the John Adamses and Thomas Jeffersons, etc. But I believe that this judgment, the fact that historians look to the Enlightenment and its classical interests as the guiding force that shaped revolutionary Americans' intellectual sensibilities and tastes, I think this judgment reflects our historians' intellectualism, number one, and their affinity, our historians' affinity for the Enlightenment, and their disinterest in and ignorance of religion and religiosity. Okay, so I think the fact that historians highlight the influence of the Enlightenment reflects the fact that modern historians, they have an affinity for the Enlightenment, and they do not have an affinity, on the whole, generally speaking, for religion and religiosity. And they don't. It's the Enlightenment is relatable to them. They understand the Enlightenment. They understand humanism. Modern historians are less familiar. Again, I'm generalizing, but I believe this generalization is warranted. Our historians, modern historians, are more strangers to religion and religiosity than they are to the Enlightenment. Okay, so I think that explains why we get this image of the Enlightenment as such a major force, and in a downgrading of the Bible, of Protestantism, etc., in shaping the philosophy and political values, ideology of early Americans. Look, I have no doubt that Enlightenment ideas about human nature and human government did trickle down to the general public through various means. But there's no doubt that Protestantism was a much, much stronger intellectual force in the minds of Anglo-Americans. And the Bible, and the Old Testament in particular, was much more familiar to them than some Enlightenment thinker they'd never heard of, never read. Okay, so even if there was a trickle down, the engagement, Americans' engagement with the Bible and with Protestantism was not trickle down. It was direct and immediate and personal. Now, Protestantism emphasized innate and immutable human sinfulness and depravity. And the Old Testament offered a particularly rich and vivid chronicle of human wickedness and abuse of power to support this theological message about human nature. So I think when we look for reasons why Anglo-Americans were so consumed by the conviction that people with power will abuse it, then before we investigate the trickle-down effects of Enlightenment theorists on government and Enlightenment historians of Greek and Roman republicanism, I think we'd benefit from looking at the direct effect of Protestant theology as confirmed and reconfirmed by both English history, Henry VIII, Charles I, Cromwell, James II, Walpole, and reconfirmed, or confirmed the first time, by biblical history, by Saul, David, Solomon, the judges, the prophets, the patriarchs. The Bible and sermons in church were simply much more prominent in Anglo-Americans' lives and their psyches than were political and philosophical and historical tracts written by intellectuals. Now, I've learned from my classes never to ask audiences how much they know, how well they know the stories of the Old Testament, because it depresses me to know the answer, to find the answer. But to us, modern Western people, for the most part, those Old Testament characters are names you've heard of. maybe you heard a parable in church that involved a few of them, one or two or three of them, or maybe you read a story that mentioned this or that biblical character, but you are not. We are not intimately familiar with them as people, like we are with our own cultural icons, okay, from television and the movies. Okay, if I say Tony Soprano, Michael Corleone, Archie Bunker, Captain Kirk and Mr. Spock, Homer Simpson, Han Solo, or Bruce Wayne, you would immediately understand what I'm talking about. You understand that character, and you get the message that I say by just dropping that name. Okay, because we're more familiar with Tony Soprano than with King David. Okay? We spend more time watching The Sopranos than reading the Bible. But for them, the Bible was by far, not even close, the most widely owned and read book in America. It was their bedtime stories and their reading lessons and entertainment and religious education and moral instruction and general education about the world, including education about human nature, human psychology, and political science. Okay, so they knew these people. They knew their life stories. They knew their characters, as well as we know, again, our cultural icons. So if you take, to illustrate this point with one example, if you look at King Saul, okay, again, one of the most not elaborate, but most evocative and really interesting stories in the Bible is the contest between, the elevation of King Saul, and then the contest between him and his usurper or successor, King David. So they, back then, those English and American readers in the 18th century, they knew that King Saul was a bad king, not because he was a uniquely bad man. In fact, they knew the opposite. They knew that he was a uniquely good and humble and admirable man. It was kingly power that transformed him into a bad king. Okay? He was a good man, but a bad king. Okay? And he was made into a bad king because of kingly power, not because of his own innate nature. And a long line of Israelite kings followed, who likewise were wicked. If you read the book of Book of Kings, okay? Each one of them confirmed the prophet Samuel's blistering exhortation to the Israelites against instituting a monarchy. Okay? Samuel warned them what a king would do. And just as Samuel had warned, these kings used the Israelites' sons and daughters as soldiers and servants. They increased the tax burden to finance their palaces. They ruled harshly. They took property arbitrarily. They instigated wars, etc. Okay. Just as Samuel had predicted and warned. But those readers, Anglo-American readers, they understood that Samuel's prediction about kings proved correct, not because he knew the future. He did not. Okay. It came true because Samuel had a biblical understanding of human nature. Okay. The Bible has a very negative view of human nature, very distrustful view of human nature. And Samuel reflected that biblical understanding of human nature. So he opposed monarchy because he believed that people with power will abuse it, because that's how human beings are. So as a civilization that shared this philosophical and theological belief about human nature, Anglo-Americans were fearful of government officials, because political power naturally and predictably produced abuse of power, or that's what they believed. Okay, they had this Old Testament understanding of human nature, and therefore believed that political power naturally, predictably produces abuse of power. And therefore, they're afraid of people with political power. They have government officials. And it's in this philosophical context that Thomas Jefferson made his Stoic observation that the natural progress of things is for liberty to yield and government to gain ground. And others followed, made similar pronouncements. For example, James Monroe similarly noted mankind's difficulties in all ages and countries to preserve their dearest rights and best privileges, as if they were impelled by an irresistible fate of despotism. So it's this bleak view of human history that explains biblical history, English history, that explains Americans' vigilance and fearfulness regarding the centralization or the centralizing imperial reforms of the 1760s. And so ever on the lookout for creeping advances in arbitrary power over the consent of the governed, they viewed with alarm parliamentary policies that strengthened the central government and weakened local communities' control over their governments and over their courts of law. And after the war, once they were independent, Americans approached the United States government with the same suspicion and vigilance. Educated by biblical, classical, and English history, many of the revolutionary generation feared that American citizens would follow the same natural impulses, again, the same natural progress of things that Jefferson was talking about, that had transformed all historical republics, biblical, Greek, Roman, into monarchies and dictatorships. So with salutary neglect as their constitutional guide, they therefore crafted a states' rights constitution that created or recreated an emasculated central government that would be unable to impose its will on local communities. Okay, this was the Articles of Confederation. And when Americans were confronted soon after in the 1780s by Federalist efforts to replace the Articles of Confederation with a new constitution, a constitution the federal constitution that promised to strengthen the central government and curtail local communities' ability to govern themselves completely, American resistance forced Madison, Hamilton, and their allies, their Federalist allies, to moderate and introduce various protections for self-government in the states. Now, a religious historian who works on this topic once told me that he was surprised by the strength of the resistance he faces both from students and from colleagues, from fellow historians, to this contention that the Bible was a strong influence on revolutionary Americans' worldviews and ideological makeup. And he's not alone in making this case. There's a good deal of literature, as I told you before, about how the Hebrew Bible was an English book and an American book. Okay, but there's broad resistance scholars and lay people to the claim that to the claim of a direct connection between Americans' religious worldview and their political worldview, and their political actions in leading to the revolution. There's broad resistance to the idea that Protestantism in the Bible, not the Enlightenment and classical history, were the primary shapers of revolutionists' political sensibilities. And I come to you as one of those resistors. I used to be one of these resistors. And over the years, as I've taught this topic more, I've gone from complete disinterest in religious history and relative ignorance on it to still being fairly ignorant, but being much more appreciative of this field of study, of its importance and relevance. The reason is that the reason that I was originally disinterested in it, I saw it as irrelevant to explaining the revolution, is that I saw in the leaders of the rebellion a bunch of people who were not particularly religious or devout, and not particularly spiritual. They were rationalists, and these same people, Adams, Jefferson, Hamilton, Washington, the Morrises, Tom Paine, and really all the all-stars of the American Revolution really were steeped in Enlightenment philosophy and classical history. So I naturally bought into the dominant narrative that highlights the Enlightenment in ancient Rome as the primary intellectual forces that shaped revolutionary Americans' ideological makeup and their political sensibilities, etc. The reason I've flipped on this issue is that as I became better educated about early America, I realized that the big question about the revolution is not why Adams or Jefferson or Washington came to support the revolution, but why did millions or hundreds of thousands of Americans support and fight for independence? When we want to understand any successful movement, we examine why people bought what its leaders were selling. What makes a movement successful are the millions of followers, not the handful of leaders. And once we shift our attention from the rich and famous that led the revolution to the millions of Americans that made this resistance movement successful, things shift pretty naturally. No one can buy the story that American farmers and sailors and shopkeepers and dock workers and teenagers were reading and discussing Rousseau and Locke and Montesquieu, or histories of ancient Greece and Rome. Okay? It makes no intuitive sense, and there's no evidence for it beyond reason. It's not based on believable reasoning, and it's certainly not based on actual hard evidence. They did not read these histories. They did not read these philosophical tracts. What they read was the Bible. We know that the Old Testament, the Hebrew Bible, had an elevated position in the religious lives and imaginations of British people and Americans in the early modern era. This was partly because it was central to Protestant theological scholarship and the Protestant project of accurately translating the Bible into vernacular languages. But the Hebrew Bible, as I said before, it resonated with English readers in particular because they identified in this chronicle of Jewish national history many cultural, spiritual, and political parallels with their own national life, with the course of their nation. So the Bible was by far the most widely owned and read book in both Britain and America. And the Great Awakening in the early mid 18th century made this Bible-centered civilization all the more so. It's evident, for example, that almanacs, which were widely sold and read in colonial America, when you read the almanac, you can see that the writers assumed a high degree of biblical literacy among their readers. They knew the public, the reading public in America, and they knew that the public is well versed in biblical lingo, and they would get biblical allusions in the same way that you and I get allusions from the movie about movies and pop culture and TV. It's evident in the biblical imagery that Tom Paine used in his pamphlets, very popular pamphlets. Again, he's writing to an audience that he knows will get the biblical references that he was making. Likewise, when Thomas Jefferson and Ben Franklin proposed a national seal for the United States featuring God guiding the Jews across the Red Sea and destroying Pharaoh's army, they assumed that Americans knew the story to which it referred and would relate to that as their story. Also, we know empirically that the Bible, again, the Hebrew Bible in particular, was the single most cited work in the political literature of the founding era, much, much, much more frequently than the works of John Locke or Montesquieu. So there's good reason to believe that this minority of religious scholars, American historians who are scholars of American religion, there's good reason to believe that they're correct, that Protestantism and the Bible were the primary shapers of revolutionary ideas. In which case, we have a pretty astounding historiographical development. You have the most dominant force shaping colonists' revolutionary mentality has become invisible to revolutionary historians. Again, except for a handful of people who are devoted to religiosity, to the history of American religion. And so if these specialists are correct, then it really is amazing that, that to think that Protestantism, theology, and the Bible were the primary factors shaping the political sensibilities of Americans, but it's been completely erased, completely invisible to a broad swath of American historians who write our textbooks and teach our students, et cetera, et cetera. So if this is indeed what happened, it would be fascinating to investigate how this reinterpretation of or reframing of the revolution away from religion happened. Okay? And the first step to understanding how it happened is identifying when it happened. Okay? When did religion and the Bible, when did it get not cut out, but when did it kind of lose its place in the telling of the American Revolution, in the coming of the American Revolution? Did it happen immediately after independence due to post-revolutionary nationalism? Did it happen only later on in the 19th century due to the work of intellectual historians who were more oriented towards political philosophy and classical humanism? Or did it happen only in the 20th century due to the orientation and methods of progressive historians and Marxist historians with their interests, with their interest in how economic and material factors shape events and ideas, and relative disinterest in spiritual and intellectual factors. So it should be easy to answer this question of when. You just have to read an endless amount of histories of the revolution from each era, from the late 18th century, from the 19th century, early 19th, late 19th, and then early and mid 20th century. Track the year of publication for each piece of scholarship, and gauge when the religious or biblical factor declined and disappeared from the narrative. So I haven't done it. I'm not going to do it, but it's a worthy project, and I invite an enterprising graduate student to take this on. It's a good story. So what I'd like to end with is a question, okay? And that is, what do you think are the implications of this reframing of the revolution? Okay, other than the fact that we are now blind to one facet of the revolution that the revolutionists thought was pretty important. Okay, but so what? Okay, is there, other than the fact that we're not as knowledgeable about what led the American revolutionists to rebel, is there some sort of real damage done to us today by having an incomplete understanding of the revolutionists' motivation and mentality? So I will gladly take any questions you have, or any comment you have about this particular issue.